Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear respected parents, guests and community members of Ilim College, may the blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon you all. I'd like to welcome you to our fifth episode of IlimCast. We have a very special guest with us today. But to kick off the discussion, we have some sad news, but also some very happy news. The sad news is that Professor Muhammad Abdullah has unfortunately fallen unwell, and he had to postpone his attendance. But the very ecstatic news for us is that we have Dr. Dylan Chown with us today, who is also from the University of Adelaide, to fill in the shoes of Professor Muhammad Abdullah. We have no doubt that, me personally knowing Ustaz Dylan, the potential that he has, that he can inshallah adequately fill in us with the required information regarding the importance of parenting in Islam. Dr. Dylan, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for having me, everyone, and welcome.
It's a pleasure to have you with us, especially on such short notice. We received an email this morning from Professor Muhammad Abdullah, and we were sort of a bit uncertain as to what we can do, but alhamdulillah, Allah sent you to us, and now we have you with us, and inshallah we pray that this is a topic that we can all benefit from, and also benefit from your experience and your knowledge. Without further ado, I'd just like to inform our guests of just a brief bio of Dylan Chown. Dylan Chown is a lecturer in the Center for Islamic Thought and Education, which is at the School of Education in the University of South Australia. His research focuses on teacher education with emphasis on Islamic pedagogy and culturally and religiously responsive pedagogy, as well as areas of inclusion and justice and school renewal. His PhD research focuses on the exploration of Islamic pedagogy in practice based on a case study of 2 Australian kinder to 12 Islamic schools. Dr. Dylan holds an MA in Education from Griffith University and a Bachelor's of Education from the Queensland University of Technology, with a double major in Physical Education and Health Education. And mashallah, Ustaz Dylan, we heard the word education a lot there, so I think it establishes your expertise in the field, and alhamdulillah, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Dr. Dylan, we're going to be doing things a bit differently. I sent you some questions, but there are also some questions that I've prepared that I want to ask you just to get to know you a bit better, inshallah. So if you don't mind, some of them might be a bit more interesting than others. But the first question, Dr. Dylan, if you could meet one person from the 20th century, who would it be?
It's a very good question. 20th century. I think it'd have to be Brother Al-Malik Al-Shabazz.
Oh, mashallah, Malik Al-Shabazz, also known as Malcolm X, yes. What is your favorite movie?
Ooh, favorite movie. Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
Look, I probably haven't watched a lot of movies recently, but if I had to name one that probably was very important in my younger years, I'd have to say Rocky. Given that I'm a health and physical education teacher, yes.
Yes. MashaAllah. Kebab or biryani?
Oh,
this is a technical one.
I didn't know there'd be such difficult questions.
Yeah.
I'd say kebab.
Kebab, yeah. South Australia or Queensland? Now you need to be careful with your answer, Dr. Dylan.
You were putting me in a very difficult position here, Ustad. I'd say my family and my heart, and I was born in Queensland. Having said that, Allah's earth is vast, and I see so many blessings in South Australia.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah. AFL, soccer or rugby?
Never heard of soccer.
Oh, don't let the Victorians hear that.
Yeah, I know. Look, I'd have to say rugby league. That's my being in Queensland.
Yeah.
But I, to be fair, I appreciate anything at a done beautifully. Yeah.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah. Mecca or Medina?
Oh, Medina has my heart. Medina has my heart. SubhanAllah. I never wanted, after Hajj, when I was in Medina, I felt like it was one place I never wanted to leave.
SubhanAllah. And finally, a favorite quote or words of wisdom that have inspired you.
Oh, this is another difficult one. I mean, there's many quotes, but I think there's probably two. The Quran would have to be the highest level of wisdom and inspiration, naturally. I think two ayah that really I access in my life regularly. One, verily, do hearts find tranquility or sakina in the remembrance of Allah? And secondly, the very well known to all of you, one we read frequently in Surah Baqarah at the end, that, you know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never test you beyond what you can manage. And those two probably are really anchoring advices that I draw on from our beautiful Quran.
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Dylan. And I think that ties in quite effectively with today's topic, and I'd like to briefly introduce the topic of today's discussion: the importance of Islam, the importance of parents in education. And I think, you know, being part of a school, what you realize is that when you have that parent, student, and also teacher connection, you really understand the power of that collaboration. So inshallah, I just want to kick off today's dialogue with yourself. We do have some questions. It will be in the format of a Q&A, followed by questions by our audience and our participants. The first question, Dr. Dylan: how important is the role of parents in education?
Excellent question. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Begin in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. And in beginning the formal part, I naturally would like to ask for abundant salutations on the paragon of creation. And given we're talking about education, the best of all educators, for verily he was sent as a teacher, our Nabi Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In opening up to, I also want to be aware that adab is a key component of education, and we're going to be talking about education. And it's not enough to talk about adab as it is to try and manifest adab, and therefore I want to thank the organisers of this event and the opportunity to contribute. Surely I will not be able to contribute or do justice as Professor Muhammad Abdullah would have. However, we benefit from different perspectives, and I'm happy to share some of my own perspectives and benefit from those listening. And inshallah, it'll be a nice warm-up to when Professor Abdullah is available, inshallah. Furthering with the question around adab, or the issue of adab, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're gathering. Naturally, Ustad is on site, so he's on the land of the Wurundjeri people, of the Kulin Nation. And I'm here in the Yugambeh speaking people here in Brisbane. Most of our work occurs on the land of the Ghana people in South Australia. I think it's important that we recognise that the land that we stand on has always been places of learning, and we are continuing on that that where we are places of learning. So let me sort of set the scene, I think, with that introduction. And your question, Ustad, again, was the importance of, or what are a broad question, or what's the importance of parents to the education of their children, correct?
Yeah.
Bismillah. Well, I guess I'll start with the obvious, and the obvious that what probably we all know to be true is that parents, particularly mothers, but parents generally, are the first teacher. So we perhaps can also make distinction between education, which is something very broad and lifelong, and schooling, which is a site for education among many sites, which would sort of tell us that the home is another site, potentially the mosque, another site, and then there's more active sites, real life, like community and so on. So I think let me begin by not sharing with you anything that you don't already know, but I think stating what's obvious and important for us to remember, that parents are our children, our students' first teacher, and they play an essential role. In the contemporary time, it's things look differently. We know the African proverb that's well known, that it takes a village to raise a child. And many people that I talk to about education who perhaps have negotiated a migration. So their own education experience was in a different context to that of their children now here in Australia. And I think it's really healthy for us to think about what we value from our own educational experience, but also conceive that the education of our children is in a different time, in a different place often, and with different needs and issues of the contemporary time. And it's for us to creatively and organically explore what that means for our own children.
Yeah. Jazakallah khairan, Ustad. Would you say there is a correlation between parent involvement and student success?
Absolutely.
The more a parent is involved, the higher that contributes to the success of the child?
Yes, but I want to sort of frame that question, because the first point that I guess I would put to my audience is, how are we defining success?
Yeah.
And of the 71 participants and 26 in person, each of us might have some common notion of what we would consider success, but equally, and we should be free to do so, equally we would have some unique ideas about what would amount to success for the education of our children. Now, if we're talking about school, it would be a great shame to reduce or narrow our frame of success to simply performance on testing, be it NAPLAN, or graduating scores, be it ATAR or the equivalent. That would be a disservice to the lofty purpose, aims and intent of education in our Islamic tradition, which has a vast, rich history. Now, what that means in the present, what it means at Ilim College, is something to be, something really important to be engaged in ongoing discussions about, because sometimes I think we assume that it's the same for every parent and it's the same for every Islamic school. And certainly there would be commonalities, but there will be unique elements, and it's important that we discuss those distinctions. So if success is only on test scores and ATAR results, I think we've done a disservice. Having said that, if you're looking for the quote-unquote evidence base, which I don't want to spend too much time on, certainly there's a correlation between involvement of parents and the narrow and underwhelming measure of academic performance. If we're looking more holistically, then certainly parents play, different roles in different families. And I think one of the greatest things I think in education, if we look at innovation, innovative research studies, is we must always reject deficit views on our children and our learners. And we must always reject deficit views on our parents. And we should avoid the blame game of blaming either the student or the parent, but each of us in our own roles rather focus on that introspection, that muhasabah, as to how am I performing my role. And we can appreciate that different parents have different abilities to be involved, or different opportunities to be involved. Some may not for reasons of work, family structure, or what have you, or health. Some may not want to be as involved, and they may defer some of that involvement. And some may be looking for more guidance as to how better to be involved. And I think those discussions are really, really important. Having worked in public schooling, one of the findings is that low expectations held by parents it leads to a lack of success on the measures that I've mentioned. However, from my own experience, and Ustad, you would know your own context here, in our Islamic school communities, it's possibly the opposite. We have very high expectations, which is, alhamdulillah, a great thing. It's a great thing that we think highly of our children. We aspire, to high levels for our children. But we should also be aware of more recent research, not necessarily only on Muslim learners, but looks at the stress in the current era in schooling, the anxiety, the mental health challenges of our learners, and we should balance our high expectations with with the needs of our learners and our children.
Yeah. Jazakallah khair. I really liked what you said at the start, defining success and not limiting it just to purely a result or an academic mark. And I think as definitely being part of a school, explaining that to the students as well as the parents is something that maybe we can be more at the forefront, but also the parents to also be exposed to that perspective. And I think tying in with that, having a strong, as a parent, myself as well, yourself as well, what are the benefits of actually having a strong engagement with the schools, and how can we effectively be involved?
It's an excellent question, and I think it should be opened up as an ongoing question and an inquiry, because sometimes we hear across schooling, in the broader sense, but also within Islamic schooling circles, sometimes we hear of tensions or disconnect between parents and schools. And I don't presume to know the Ilim college context, but it's a wonderful question for both parties in partnership to be asking one another. So the school asking, well, how are we currently engaging our parents? How else might we seek to engage them? And for parents to ask that question of themselves, how can I be engaged in the school? What current opportunities do I have? But also to be engaged in some discussion with the school as to what that might look like. And local needs and local nuances count. How the school down the road does this engagement may not work for Ilim College. And I think that nia of setting out on a journey together to find out what that could look like could be as powerful a process as, in fact, the outcomes that come from it.
Beautiful. Yeah.
And I think you heard the English saying, that the squeaky wheel gets the attention. What we should be cautious of, and this is something for us as educators in schools, sometimes there's a discourse or a rhetoric around that people are intimidated or a little bit scared to engage with parents because they feel they might be overbearing or they might be cause tensions by their involvement. And when we don't have productive and open dialogue and when we're not open to what it could look like, then we leave parents really with only one opportunity for voice, and that's the protest voice. So that, to make noise and to make a point. And it's not necessarily the most productive form of voice, as opposed to the collaborative, cooperative, and development one that we express initially.
Yeah. Next question, Mr. Dylan. What role does an Islamic school have in providing Islamic education, or more broadly tarbiyah, compared to the roles that parents have? Or worded differently, how can they both complement each other? How can the school and parents work hand in hand to effectively cultivate or work towards the holistic development of the learner?
Mashallah, it's a wonderful question, and I'm very cautious. One of the things that we see in contemporary schooling, which is a great limitation, and that is because of the commercialization and a neoliberal influence, which means, what I mean by that is because economic ways of seeing the world dominate our socio-political environments. So when the media, Facebook, politicians, whenever they're commenting about schooling, it's often through purely an economically driven agenda. And one of the outcomes or the implications of this is the fact that school has become very dominated by standardization. And I'm very careful when I get a question like that of providing a response that might be interpreted to be a standard response, when I don't think a standard response is actually beneficial. So those questions, can I say as someone in Islamic schooling, someone who's a researcher, I find those questions to be some of the most profound questions that if could be opened up in your school community, and if there could be open dialogue where your educator colleagues and team are discussing these questions from an educator perspective, that we're hearing the voice of parents, where there's opportunities for parents to share their perspective. And critically, and Professor Abdullah and I recently did an article on student voice.
Yeah.
What would be the value of hearing from the voice of our young people? I mentioned about rejecting deficit views. Therefore, if we have a strength-based view of our children or our learners, then and I know that my colleagues that are there as whether it be the educators or fellow parents, our children have such rich insights. If you were to, who else is a better expert than someone who's spent 10 to 12 years in a school as a learner? They're very well equipped to answer such questions for their own, to offer insight to such questions. So I think those types of questions are best asked locally and left open. Certainly, we could start with understanding, well, what do we mean by, as a starting point? We could ask the question, what do we all mean by tarbiyah? Tarbiyah, in a simple translation, we could mean nurturing, nurturing of our students or our children. For educators, it has a very strong, how we understand that will shape our approaches to learning and teaching. If we understand tarbiyah as being a drawing out process, a drawing out of the innate and unique qualities and strengths of each of our individual learners, not an easy thing to do, but if we understand that, then that shifts us away from being educators that see that our main role is to pour knowledge into the empty vessel, which is the student. So therefore, that changes our whole approach to learning and teaching to one of a drawing out process, one of recognising that our learners are born on fitrah, that they're not deficit, that there's no problem inherently in the child from who they are, from what their background is, from what their cultural beliefs are, that rather we see strengths, and our primary responsibility as either educators or parents is to provide a conducive learning environment, whether it be in the school or the home, that's conducive to the fitrah and which is conducive to tarbiyah, however we, as in you, are understanding the meaning of tarbiyah. Is that too technical, Ustad?
No, I appreciate it. And I just want to follow up with another question to what you said towards the end. Would you say that it can, if there is a sort of a conflict between the tarbiyah of the home and the tarbiyah of the school, that can lead to dissonance, internal conflict, identity struggles with the students? Would you say it's very important or essential that there is harmony between the tarbiyah method at the school and also what's being taught at home? For example, we sometimes hear, when we speak about prayer, when we try to teach students prayer, they might say, when I go home, but for example, the people residents in my house don't pray, for example, and so and vice versa. It can happen. The parents might have a higher standard of religiosity compared to the school, for example. Would you say it's important that that balance is there?
I'm going to be controversial here, Ustad.
Yeah. Tafaddal, Sheikh.
And I'm going to. I'll announce my niyyah. I'll announce my intention for approaching this question in such a way so that people can see my intent, inshallah, explicitly.
Okay.
We've many of us have probably heard, and it's a talk we hear often in the masjid. And when you begin looking outward and you start pointing the finger, and you can see my finger, I'm pointing, which means I'm assessing others in terms of their religiosity, what they're doing. But really, there are three fingers that are pointing to me, which are the ones that are bent, which is telling me that there's far more value in introspectively looking at our own selves rather than pursuing a line where we look outward. And I'll give another analogy.
Yeah.
And I'll be a little bit crude with this one. You've probably seen in parenting books and things of the like, and none of us, alhamdulillah, have this issue, inshallah. But in places where, I've seen this in rougher schools, which are not relevant, one would hope, for Islamic schools. But you've heard of the idea of a swear jar. When somebody utters a foul word, they put money in the jar, which is a way of reminding them that this is not a good practice, that we would hope for better language. In the same way, I think it would be a wonderful practice for us in our staff rooms and our meetings that whenever we start looking to blame students or parents that we put money in the jar, and I don't mean literally, I mean as a metaphorical. Yeah. There's no doubt what you just said is important, that there's harmony. Now, harmony doesn't mean sameness. Yeah. Doesn't mean the same thing. Our community is super diverse, multi-ethnic, multicultural, and each of us are on different parts of our journey in faith. So how I understood, how I lived my faith 5 years ago, I would hope, inshallah, I'm in a better position today. And so would all of my brothers and sisters. So if that's the case, then we should not hope for sameness, because uniformity doesn't mean unity. So what you said was profound, that it would be beneficial for there to be harmony between approaches in the school and harmony between approaches that are valued in the home. However, we should not expect sameness. Yeah. We will set ourselves up. Our children are entering a world, and ultimately how we live our life in this world is with a view to the hereafter. But certainly in this world, we live amongst diversity all the time. So expecting that parents can, quote unquote, toe the line with what we as a school think is a valuable approach, I think poses a huge problem for our NIA and for the way we engage. So what I would say is that we as educators, applying the finger analogy, we would have far more value in looking introspectively at what we are doing in the school environment, and the dialogue that I mentioned earlier, the conversations that we have with parents, with families, with students, would allow synergy and harmony, but not necessarily sameness. Yep. We also understand that with all things Islamic, and if we're looking at the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ as the paragon of a teacher, as the best of all teachers, then we cannot forget the foundational prophetic qualities of mercy. Put simply, some teachers are in early career stages and are doing their best and are learning. Equally, some parents have challenges and difficulties of which they cannot provide the same environment that someone else can. And with mercy, we can seek to balance the strengths and weaknesses for each learner. That's a long answer, but I hope that that provides something.
I think you made some profound points, and as educators, I think there is a lot that we can take from that as well. Ustad, I'm going to kick off the Q&A now with parents, but what I'd like to do is have the honor of asking the first question, if I may. I know I've asked many questions, but this is sort of a bit different. Now, there's a statement of Ali bin Abi Talib radiallahu anh that is profound. It's in regard to pedagogy and raising children. He says, play with them for the first 7 years of their life, then teach them for the next 7 years, so until they're 14, and then advise them for the next 7 years until they're 21. So I have a little toddler who's 1.5 years old. Now, when this statement, when Ali radiallahu anh says play with them, I guess the question that stands out for me is how should our form of inculcating religious practice or showing religious practice take place, if that makes any sense?
Excellent question, mashallah. Yeah. Look, I think this is a question that I will have a go at answering as an educator, but I think Professor Muhammad Abdullah would provide a perspective that I can't. Yeah. Because he's a professor of Islamic studies. And the statement, and some of you, I just want to put a disclaimer on, so that we don't get distracted by the statement and we focus on the essence of it. Some argue that it was Umar radiallahu an, some say Ali radiallahu an, some question its authenticity, and so on. But those are things that I'm not trained, or I don't feel in a position to comment on, but just let's put a place marker for Professor Abdullah to address that question, because I think it's one that comes up a lot. Having said that, what we can say, and I'll try to give a technical answer in the beginning, which is perhaps something that teachers will relate with, and a broader answer which might resonate with some parents. From a technical point of view, we understand that almost all approaches in teaching, whether we're talking about pedagogy, learning and teaching, whether we're talking about our approaches or our models of behaviour management, if we're talking about models for well-being, if we're talking about models for resilience, name whatever educative model. And at the basis of each and every one of those models is a particular theorization of the child. And what that means is that a theory underpinning how educators view children. Add to that, there's a philosophical and theoretical orientation to the stages of child development. Now, if we have been trained in a quote unquote normative Bachelor of Education degree in a university anywhere in the West, then we will have been exposed to Erikson, to Piaget, to Vygotsky and other theorists that have offered a particular theory of the child and have offered their hypothesis on child development. None of those look at the theory of the Muslim child or the theory of child development within education in the Islamic tradition. None of them have. And which is one of the reasons why in our graduate certificate and in our teacher programs that we provide training and the archive, we provide access to the archive that looks at what scholars have said about the Muslim child, what theory do they look at the Muslim child, and how do we understand the stages of development. I can provide a reading from my dear colleague, Dr. Nadeem Memon, that looks at the 3 stages, which are different to Eric's stages. And therefore, this is a longer discussion that we could have. But certainly, big decisions on why we teach, who teaches, when we teach, and how we teach are often mediated by such things. To give now the more practical and the less technical, we understand that there is so much value in the playing with our children and the importance of play. Some beautiful things around imaginative play. And the Quran is full of narratives, beautiful stories. And our children at particular ages benefit from the, innovative pedagogical approaches, or even play in the home, where they engage in imaginative play around narratives and stories within our tradition. Play-based pedagogy is something that's valued in sport and physical activity. I often talk about, as a HBE teacher, which is beyond the 7 years, the importance of play because physical activity and sport provide authentic environments to live faith, to manifest our faith in an environment. Finally, if I can address the question you said, 7, 7 and 7, there is some, I don't want to sort of get weighed down on the tensions between the authenticity of that. However, we see value. I want to stress that the impact of neoliberalism on schooling has had an impact on Islamic schools, as my PhD demonstrates, and it does, willingly or unwillingly, impact our parents as well. So we start worrying about putting children in desks in kindy or prep to prepare them for NAPLAN, because we see that as an important measure of success. When we might ask, when we enforce reading programs, when we put students in desks, what type of pedagogy, how we play, all of these are important things. Similarly, at the back end, when we're talking about middle year schooling or senior schooling, how this is a critical question for both parents and educators. For educators, how do we see our learners and how do we engage with them, given that they're young adults? In the Islamic tradition, and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf talks about this, adolescence as a stage is a Western modern construct. In the time gone by, and I'm not dismissing that it's relevance, but in time gone by, you were a child, and then upon attaining balagh or puberty, you were an adult.
Yeah.
Now, I'm suggesting that the graduate that leaves our Islamic school is a young adult.
Yeah.
So how do we engage with that young adult, that vicegerent in the making? How do we engage with that vicegerent in the making in their senior years of schooling? For parents, how do we transition from being one that's modelling, guiding, disciplining, nurturing, to a stage where we're entering a different phase in the relationship? And I'm not an expert on such things. I'm navigating the same thing with my own children. I apologise if my response is...
No, you've touched on revolutionary ideas that I think is incumbent upon us to ponder over deeply, because we have preconceived notion of what education is, what learning is, what the student is, and the points that you've touched upon is definitely important. I want to now go to our participant questions, inshallah. So we have the first question is, how do we draw the limits of interference when we involve ourselves in teaching our kids, especially during remote learning, so it doesn't stress out parents and kids?
That's an excellent thing. I guess I'd have two parts to that. One, we should never allow dominant ways of thinking and dominant rhetoric as a result of the advent of mass schooling that sidelines parents. When did we as parents fail to remember that no one knows their children like we do? Well, no one knows their children like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But in terms of people, no one knows their own children better than the parent. And certainly we value and respect that teachers have tremendous relationships with their educators. And I don't have to, my colleagues know this well. It's a special relationship. And it's a different relationship than the parent. But my advice to parents is never ever allow that rhetoric of mass schooling to dislodge or to sideline you when no one knows their learner better, their child better than you, and no one loves their child better than you, other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you bring invaluable things. As parents, when we self-examine, we also realise that we bring different strengths and weaknesses. And part of the humility of being a mu'min or a mu'minah is to recognise where my strengths are and to use them, and where my weaknesses are and where maybe to reach out for others. So that's one thing. The second thing, the part of that question, how to, I guess, engage positively with learning, I really feel that's a local question. It's a question to be in dialogue with individual teachers, because we shouldn't seek for standardisation. We shouldn't. Yep. Each educator there has their own repertoire, has definitely the same vision at the school, definitely a common philosophy and a common vision for learning, but each educator there has unique and rich expertise and learning and teaching techniques that are responsive to their own learners based on the relationship they have with that learner. So my advice would be, I guess, that the dialogue between individual educators and parent cohorts is where you'd get the most value in finding out where that could be. And for educators, we appreciate that different parents have different stresses, work hours. One parent's at home, some aren't. So there needs to be that flexibility and understanding.
Shukran, Ustad. Next question. Can you please explain the importance of discipline and restorative approach rather than a punitive approach?
MashaAllah, what a question. I'm doing a course now on managing learning environments in university. So we're into week 3 and we've been having this discussion. Bismillah. Bismillah. Let me be concise, inshallah. Bismillah. Every approach to education or to pedagogy is influenced by its own philosophy, its own worldview, and its own way of seeing, of understanding knowledge. So in our education in the Islamic tradition, of which Islamic schools seek to draw on, in addition to contemporary approaches, we're not for closed places. We ground ourselves in our own tradition, but we look expansively at what works in contemporary practice. What we understand is that the Prophet ﷺ, when he disciplined people, he did so with dignity, and when he dignified people through his discipline, and he disciplined them with dignity. We have a rich thinking around maintaining the dignity of the child. In a secular way, we hear about human rights and the rights of the child. Of course, in our tradition, great medieval scholars, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, and others have written beautiful treatises on the rights of parents, the rights of teachers, the rights of children, some of which we could definitely benefit from. If I step away from the secular argument about human rights, which I think would be subsumed if we are dignifying our children, that we think about our practices. If we publicly reprimand there's no precedence in our tradition to publicly reprimand students. People argue in the justice space that removing students from their learning may be unjust. There's a beautiful, Ibn Khaldun spoke about the harm that harsh discipline does to the psyche, to the soul, to the nature of the learner. We would say that contemporary approaches, again, are based on neoliberal, authoritative approaches which seek to control and create order in schools. In other words, conform and perform. We as teachers have to be very, very strong, and usually it comes from the school leader that pushes back against that type of policy and that type of rhetoric, to say that in an Islamic school, it's not enough to have students conforming. We hope for a more transformative form of education. And therefore, we're interested in the needs of the learner. We must go beyond the symptom that we see, would it be misbehaviour or inappropriate conduct, and look at what is the unmet need for that learner. I'll finish on this. We do a whole course on this, but we also have an approach called Dignified Way, which is an approach that seeks to apply a framework for behaviour and a framework for character that's what we would argue grounded in the tradition and responsive to contemporary needs in education. So I think I've touched on a few points. It's such a big question and such a...
Okay, so we've got time for a couple more questions, inshallah. So question 3, should I be worried if my child is not keeping up with the set standard by the curriculum, or should I just let the child develop in their own space, at which point I should be, and I can't see the rest of that, but yeah, so should I be worried if my child's not keeping up with the set standard by the curriculum, or should I just let the child develop on their own and space?
This is another big question, and one that really, again, is worthy of discussion between educators and parents. Bob Lingard, who is a leading educationalist in Australia, asks a question about the Australian curriculum. And he questions what knowledge ought to be conjured in the learner and what person ought to be conjured through the curriculum. Now, as a parent, I'd probably I'll announce my bias. I'm not moved by standards. I'm not moved at all by standards. Every child develops at their own time in their own place. And go back to your original niyyah for your children when they were born and the du'as you made for them. Go back to that feeling when they entered prep. What did you hope for that child? And I think you'll find that there's a common linear relationship where we had aspirations around, Ya Allah, bless this child, Ya Allah, use them for the sake of Allah, Ya Allah, make them the light of my eye. All of these types of du'as and intentions and aspirations. When they entered school, we said, we want to support them, we want them to be happy, we want them to be a good person. And somewhere along the line, we get dominated by neoliberal discourse and narrow discussions around standards. Each and every one in the room as educators, and all of you as parents here, how you definitely a positive schooling experience is a key determinant for outcomes in life. And there's enough evidence to suggest that. But none of us are the sum total of our performance at school. All the wonderful educators that you have in front of you have grown and developed and are far better than whatever score they attained as students. And parents, same. So my advice is that do work with individual educators who are the ones that best know how your child, in the school context, how they're developing, where they may need support, these sorts of things. But I wouldn't be concerned. Standards to me would be a secondary thing. As a parent, I did not even look at my child's NAPLAN result. And when I was called up to the school to conference, I said to them, I haven't looked at it. And they were shocked. They said, but you're in education. And I said, yes. And I said, well, the reason I didn't look at it is because I didn't think it would be an educative endeavour to look at it. So I'm controversial. I'm a conscientious objector. There is no evidence anywhere in the world that can support that low stakes testing or standardisation leads to improved student outcomes. Zero evidence, none. And I know from colleagues in Islamic schooling and school leaders, many of them are deeply aware of this, and therefore they use NAPLAN sparingly and rather focus on their own measures of success, and I would say the same to parents.
Okay. Ustaz, I'm being informed by the producer that we've got a couple of minutes of recording time left, so if we can maybe just fit in one question.
Sure.
Can you please provide us with practical strategies of how to deal with hindrances to a student's and parents' remote learning journey, stress-wise and pedagogical-wise, especially if a student has special needs to be met? If you can maybe summarize that answer very quickly, we'd appreciate that, Sheikh.
I'm nervous in answering that question to do justice in the time. I think pedagogically, I think we need to think about what are our learning intentions and not fall into giving students busy work. Learning in the home is, you do not bring school home. Remote learning is not bringing school home. It's a different form of learning and teaching, and one that may in fact be quite shorter than the school day. So focusing on busy work, particularly for students that may have particular needs, is not the focus. Focus on the learning intentions and how that might be enacted for our students. For parents, I think the key to us is how do we reset the rhythm of the home, because it's changed. We're at home longer. The rhythm of a normal, of quote unquote, the new normal. How do we maintain balance in our students' lives so that they're getting enough sleep, enough rest, enough exercise, a space and time to engage in the learning and support, that they're ready for it, that they're little things like being off. How much screen time are we having? When does it shut off? Are they on screen time before a lesson, which is not going to be in the best interest of the child or the educator? These types of questions, but again, a beautiful discussion to be had amongst individual educators and their parents and students.
Jazakallah khairan, Ustad. I really appreciate the fruitful thoughts that you've laid out for us. I think one of the most important things to take away for me personally is that there are more questions that have been asked, and I think these questions are important to contemplate over, because it gets us to sort of rethink of the paradigm in which we are viewing education, and also from an educator perspective, my involvement in education, also from a parent perspective. So on behalf of Ilim College and also our wonderful participants, I'd like to thank you for contributing to this discussion, and inshallah we look forward to hosting you in the future. And I really genuinely want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this last minute involvement. You really made things a lot easier on our end, so may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you abundantly, inshallah, accept your intentions and allow us to unite in Firdaus the way He has united us here on a virtual platform, inshallah.
Ameen.
Last words, last remarks, Ustad? for the
I
audience?
guess, last comment is that there's a self-determining and richness and beauty in setting out on a path to knowing. And we know that a prerequisite to all learning is humility. So having these big questions and not necessarily having the answers is something we shouldn't worry about, because that embeds, that inculcates in us the necessary humility to begin the path. And when we have shared challenges, through dialogue and engagement, we can come up with shared solutions. And I think we start shifting the conversation away from problems to solutions, from challenges to opportunities. And I think that's what I've tried to share today. I have been a bit controversial in some points because I wanted to agitate and push thinking. I really apologise that there wasn't a two-way. I'm coming in as a guest and I don't want to impose, as a guest should not. So I hope that I've provided something good, inshallah. But I obviously defer that those that are based locally know best, and I'm a guest coming in to perhaps challenge some of that thinking. So I want to thank everyone for the opportunity. Jazakallah khair.
Wayakum Ustad. And I'd like to thank the audience as well for the participation. There have been many unanswered questions, but inshallah what we can do is we hope to have Professor Muhammad Abdullah next week, hopefully feeling much better. And so we can maybe pass those questions on to him, inshallah, and he can answer them for us. May Allah reward everyone for attending. I'd like to thank you all again, and my best wishes are with you and with the Ummah and also all of humanity, inshallah. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillah rabbil alamin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.